Hey everybody, I'm your host Zenitsu, and you're listening to the Digi Talks podcast, the show that covers various topics from news to meta developments and everything in between for the fine folks who love the Digimon trading card game. Just as a quick reminder, I do stream this live over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu. It also gets uploaded as a YouTube video under the YouTube channel of Zenitsu, as well as going up on various different podcasting platforms like Spotify. Today, I'm with my co-host Teddy, and we're going to be talking about what the BT13 meta kind of means, where it's currently at, as we have one more event to talk about in terms of like actual regional data, on top of the fact that we're going to dip a little bit more into something unusual and talk about defining what Jank means and the different kind of like subcategories in Digimon decks when it comes to their overall strength and power level. So I guess to start things off with the meta report and meta developments, we had a couple of events that happened. They were competitive BT13. They weren't exactly Ultimate Cup. We know Ultimate Cup is going to be on the horizon. It's going to be interesting to see what comes of that when those actually start. But as far as like the main event that we're going to be talking about, it was the European Raiden trade. And that was a pretty decent event, 102 players, 7 rounds of Swiss, best of 3, and it doesn't really look like from the top 16, kind of anything new has happened. It is just literally the same old that we've been seeing for a while now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect anything to change too much, like Shine Gray clearly at the top of this in terms of usage. Royal Knights following close behind, and then of course Hunters tying in usage for top 16 at least. So I mean, it makes sense. There's still a wide variety of decks. Still about what 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's not the worst, but we knew that it wouldn't be anything different unless somebody finds something crazy that breaks the meta. I don't think we're going to see anything too different coming up soon.
Yeah, so out of the 8 different archetypes, out of the top 16, 8 different archetypes, the breakdown is 5 Shines, 3 Hunters, 3 Royal Knights, 1 Alpha, 1 Machine Dramon, 1 Black War Greymon, Red Black Greymon, specifically more focused on Black War Greymon X, 1 Blue Flare, and 1 Red Hybrid. So nothing new here was able to break into the meta per se, and obviously Shine took first place as being one of the most played decks and one of the most powerful decks. Second place was Royal Knights, third place was Hunters, fourth was Shine, fifth was also Shine, sixth was Alphamon, seventh was Shine, 8th was Hunters, 9th was Machine Dramon, 10th was Royal Knights, 11th was also Royal Knights, 12th was Greymon, the Black War Greymon deck, 13th was Blue Flare, 14th was Shine, 15th Hunters, and 16th Red Hybrids. So that is currently just where that event was, and I ran through the numbers, and it really doesn't change the numbers that much in terms of like the percentage on what we're seeing what. So yeah, the meta just is kind of solidified. We did have 2 other events. One we kind of didn't have exactly a whole lot of data on. We have the top 8 spread for how large of an event that was, and that was the Carta Magica event. It wasn't a regional, but it was still a sizable Digimon event. It was only 6 rounds, so that means there must have been ties at top tables a little bit more often. There was 119 players versus the EU event, which is 102 players, so comparable in size. And Beelzemon ended up winning this one, and the only deck, I don't even think this was like that new of a deck. I think it won at least one other event, or like topped one other event, and that was the Black War Greymon OTK. So it's more focused on just building 2 level 4s, DNA into Chimera, Digivolve into the promo Black War Greymon to just Digiburst the entire stack away and try to kill the opponent in one shot. So it's cool that OTK decks like that are still able to exist. Japan was playing with that for a hot minute. So if anyone's curious, that deck was birthed in Japan, as most things are.
Yeah, most of the cool sauce is solved over there, and then every now and then we have our stuff. But for the most part, I think it's usually they find out, and then we adapt it and change it and make it our own. But I think this guy just literally copy and pasted a deck from a Japan list.
I mean, sometimes those Japan spices, they could surprise people, and they could do a decent amount of work just because of the unfamiliarity with the matchup.
Listen, a stack that can swing multiple checks and have protection on it. I mean, that can keep swinging as much as they want. I mean, that's pretty good. That's pretty solid.
Yeah, and then there was the TAC Oceania Regional. This was 5 rounds and only 57 players, so a lot smaller than a lot of the other events when it comes to the regionals. We do have their top 16 breakdown, but with how small it is, it's not like this data would be like super conducive and really changing things. Just because of the size of the event, I do think that led to a couple of decks, in quotation marks, breaking into the format. I don't really see it as them breaking into the format personally. Not discrediting the skill of the players and the builds at all. It's just I think in larger events, there's a reason why we haven't seen these types of decks top. And the 3 decks that were kind of surprising was Gallant Mon was able to top in the TAC event. Then there was a Mastermind, and then there was a Rosemont.
Let's see. I'm looking at. I'm just trying to see if there's any crazy shenanigans, but no. This. I mean, the Rosemont deck looks just like a normal Bloom Lord deck, except they just took Bloom Lord out in the Rosemont.
Well,
Basically
aren't
all
they
you get.
using Bloomlord also still? Like they
No,
just
not this list.
not this. Oh yeah, they literally just swapped out the Bloomlord for the Rosemon, and everything else is pretty much the same.
Yeah, basically it's just all a normal Bloom Lord list,
Oh, they're
and
not
then
running Argetta. That's another distinction.
yeah,
I mean, that's fair. They're not. You don't need Argetta for what Rose is trying to do because Rose doesn't care about suspending your own stuff, which is part of the problem with Rose is she cares about suspending the opponent's stuff, which means in order for her to be effective, the opponent needs to have stuff to begin with. The at least like the addition of being able to suspend tamers is nice, so it gives her a little bit more reach on what she could do. But yeah, I think like just the concept of suspending the opponent's stuff to be able to make your stuff better or good, I think that's just inherently not super great, which is why Bloomlord has been more successful.
yeah, that's too limiting. You would need your opponent to have some sort of advantage, and then you're kind of playing to come back. But Rosemont doesn't hit hard enough to warrant the comeback, whereas Bloom Lord just absolutely shreds on the comeback. So I don't see why you would want to do that. But this person did well, so I guess in this event he did. It was the right choice. I'm not gonna complain about it, but
No, I do think
uh,
it's the size of the event that led to something like that being more successful.
yeah,
Just because
57
there's
players. I mean,
just because there's fewer people in the event, fewer rounds being played, and fewer like matchups you would actually have to hardcore worry about. It's like at small events, like this is one of the reasons why people were championing store championships not having invites is because the size of the event for the qualifications you were getting, people didn't exactly think that met the qualifications. Um
yeah,
I think like
understandable, but
yeah, just because anything could kind of win at that small of an event. Like Gallant Mon, because I think Gallant Mon in larger events with more opponents, especially if you're doing well, it's gonna get harder and harder for Gallant going up against some of the actual big dogs. He just doesn't have that great of comeback potential. Like he's a good deck, don't get me wrong. I love the deck with the burning passion. I think it's really cool on what he's trying to do. It's just I think in terms of like overall efficiency, he's not exactly there to go toe to toe with something like Shine.
oh no, who you telling? I love this deck with all my heart. This is my favorite Digimon, my favorite deck. I almost have the whole deck max rarity, but um, and I mean max rarity, like with all the crazy stuff. But it's too many things need to go right for you to for your game plan to be amazing. The new Gallant Mon BT12 was solid, and it definitely was a step in the right direction. But it's not good enough. Like the fact that the game plan of the deck wants your opponent to have stuff on the board, which means that you're already putting yourself at a disadvantage because you want them to have things on the board, and then it's too easy to clap back with no protection and no way to prevent them from hitting your bigger bodies. It's a very fragile deck. If you do get the advantage, yes, you'll chokehold your opponent until they just decide, you know what, let me just build a stack in the back, and then now they win. Now they win because you can't deal with the stuff in the back.
I mean, the gimmick in terms of like the, because I like to look at decks as in like their damage potential out of nowhere, like off of almost a clear field. What is the deck able to do in order to succeed? And I think like
Three, depending on maybe more if you have a lot of trash.
I think like the BT13 Gallant definitely is a good card to fulfill that type of role. And then it does have the Warp Guilmon and the Biomerge Takato to kind of help shore up those weaknesses in terms of like, okay, I could go out of raising level 3 into level 6 out of nowhere. And I think like that's pretty powerful, especially in a field where if there's enough Royal Knights players, then you probably could actually farm them. I don't know the matchup well enough to say if that is the case, but I think like there is an argument where you could do well against Royal Knights in this type of with this type of a deck.
If they're smart, they just loop the Alpha Mons, and then you just never get a chance to actually play. Because then you'd have to play low to the ground, and I mean it's a hard matchup because you can deal with their bodies very easily, but the problem is they're playing the bodies pretty efficiently due to the reduction and not
Yeah,
giving you a lot of memory to work with most of the time,
and it only
unless they
gets
just
worse over
start to.
time, and that's where Blitz kind of comes in handy, but Blitz can only do you so much.
And honestly, some of the stuff they do play, like if they drop an Omekamon, they want that to die. So it's like you don't you don't really want to kill the Omekamon, but a lot of the attacking effects are mandatory, so they have to happen. So you will be forced essentially to kill it, and then you give them an extra resource. I think it's a pretty unwinnable matchup unless they break really hard.
Well, the
If they break really
idea
hard, then yeah.
the idea seems like you just kill their bodies as like if you're able to be able like get your level 6 out and they don't have a good enough response to your level 6, especially the raid Gallant, then you just kill everything that they hard play, and then that really will set them behind because then they won't have anything to tuck underneath. So they have to find alternative means to tuck cards underneath. And I think like that's the only situation in which Gallantmon would be able to be successful in that type of a matchup. But I do think like because the reduction just gets cheaper and cheaper the later the game goes, and if you're unable to deal with those level 6 bodies, then you do just kind of lose the game. And Alphamon does kind of single-handedly just suck because you won't be able to kill it. It's just going to suck it up anyway. And yeah, that's just going to be a hard one.
I mean, I guess you can technically. No, you can't bypass it. If you have the X antibody, then maybe, but then you'd only be able to go into like because it's 10 cost. No, you could technically use it if you had X antibody swing with the level 5 Evo into Galamon X, nuke something, trash a security, and then you're still swinging because you swung with the other Digimon first. So technically you could get around it, but that's a big if, and even then, like you're realistically they're just gonna just stall you out. They'll just keep stalling, and some of them are running Congo, and some of them are like you'll never ever get a chance to realistically hit them. Your only real out is you pressure them so hard early that they are forced to do an inoptimal Omnimon and only drop like 4 or 5 bodies, maybe less, and then pray they can't kill you. Like, and then you can actually pick apart the board. But
I mean,
if
that's
they
that's
do
where
that,
like the biomargin, like the digivolving into a level 6 off of like nothing. That's the core strength. I do think though, unfortunately for the deck, it only has like two efficient ways of being able to play Toccato, and if you don't have the Blitz Toccato, you're basically kind of just auto losing that because then you won't be able to use your cards effectively.
it is the worst, honestly. If you don't see that blitz staccato, you just hate the game. You're just not having fun because they'll just sit there and all your stuff costs way too much. Uh, Rightfully so because they are very strong.
I don't even think it
But
costs too much. It's fair. I think the deck is too fair.
yeah, that's probably the best way to put it because like 4 cost is a pretty good value for his Evo cost because he does so much when attacking, delete something or trash a security and then raid. He like that makes a sense. The Gallant Mon 5 cost Evo, that card is insanely strong.
Like
The
it's
multiple forms of deletion, the cards are absurdly strong, so it makes sense that they cost so much. But like the thing is, there are decks that have these absurd abilities, but they cost nowhere near as much, or they have ways to efficiently reduce them. Whereas Galamon, your way to reduce them is by destroying things, and if they just don't play anything, then you don't get to reduce the cost.
and
And
that's
then
that's kind of where Mastimon is as well. Like DNA is still just a very powerful thing, but I think like where the stage of the game is, it's asking for too much setup, and because there's a lot of like hyper powerful decks that are able to set themselves up basically turn 1 or turn 2, if Mastimon, which is way less efficient at doing that, isn't able to do that, then it does also fit in that same category where it is just playing too fairly, moving too slowly for its own good, even though it's still playing with a lot of absurdly powerful effects.
yeah, I think Mastamon is also out of state of it needs a lot to go right. A lot to go right for them to for the deck to pop off, period. Like the idea of having a 2 level 5 bodies that'll stay on the board is very very hard nowadays.
I mean, that's where Mirai comes in, where you raise
Yeah,
one or hard play one,
but that's a
Mirai plays the other
that's a
one.
5 cost. Like you're basically hoping that comes out of security. It is the worst. Like I love this deck because I played the hell out of it, and actually, funnily enough, I had this deck max rarity. Um, but it, it just playing that tamer sucks, man. Like it is the worst feeling to just
I'm
drop that 5 cost tamer.
I'm surprised. Don't tell anybody else, but I'm surprised people haven't found out the secret tech of the Geo Greymon. Yes, the
Yeah,
Evo for 3 cost sucks, but the fact that you have a way to
better than
be able to,
5.
yeah, the fact that you have a way to be able to try to play one of your tamers out of security if it's there, is pretty important. Like setting up your tamers right now is easily one of the most important aspects to decks right now. If you don't have efficient ways to be able to set up your tamers, if your deck relies or heavily wants them, then your deck isn't going to function as well as it should. Like that's kind of the problem with Imperial, is because Imperial has 0 ways to set up any of its tamers. All of their tamers cost a lot for what it's asking for. And if you're basically not playing your tamers turn 1 and turn 2, you're just not playing them at all for the entire game, and your tamers do so much for that deck. It's actually insane.
No, no, like your tamers are like your lifeblood. If you don't have your tamers, you just don't do nothing. Or the game plan is a lot harder without them.
Yeah.
And the same with Mastamon. Mastamon falls into that category of you really need the Mirai on the board. If you don't get Mirai early enough, you just fall behind so hard. And every deck outpaces you. Literally, every deck outpaces you. Even like decks like Security Control outpace this deck nowadays. It's pretty it's pretty bad how much a lot of decks just straight up beat this because of power, creep and things like that.
I mean, Ordainimon's pretty good. Like, I don't think that for a Mastimon list, the list is bad. I don't think that. I just think, like, in the face of basically the way I described the top 5 last time, which I'm going to probably do a better job at, like, that thought process, is we realistically have 3 hyper powerful decks that are dominating the format. It's number 1 is Shine, number 2 is Hunters, and number 3 is Black War Greymon. Or Red Black Greymon, more specifically Black War Greymon. It's been having more success than War Greymon, even though they're both very similar. One's just more offensive, one's more control. And I think the control aspect is where a lot of people are leaning into finding success, is because we have this triangle where we have the Hunter's deck as the aggro deck, we have the mid-ranger combo deck being Shine Greymon, and then we have the control deck being Black War Greymon. So we have that rock, paper, scissors dynamic between the top 3. Then we have decks like Bloomlord and decks like Royal Knights, where they are good, but they are more the gatekeepers rather than, like, I'm consistently winning because I'm that much better than everyone else. They're consistently winning because they are the gatekeepers, so anything that's not borderline on par with them, they just steamroll and dominate. And this is more prevalent in some of the data that we got in terms of matchup breakdowns with Bloomlord. Like, it loses to all of the top decks, but it wins against all of the decks that are basically beneath it, acting as that gatekeeper. And then because of the clock-based style of play that Royal Knights has, that also just naturally leads it to be a gatekeeper position.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the best way to explain it. There's that weird line where if they can't deal or can't beat this, then you're kind of in, like, the worst possible position, because then you can't actually break in.
Because I think, like, the meta spread right now, having 18 decks that are, like, somewhat playable, is still a pretty good spread. And I'm not saying, like, things just can't top or compete. It's just when it comes to the nitty gritty, what people really care about, like, and the results in terms of what actually is the objectively the best, like, those 5 decks are where you would want to be at and what people are going to lean towards first. I mean, I still think Red Hybrids is a fantastic deck, and I love that deck with the burning passion of 1,000 Suns, because I am a dirty, filthy aggro player. And I do think in this type of a format, it's Red Hybrids is in a better position than something as combo heavy as Mirage, because I tried Mirage and it just did not feel very good, just because its pieces exactly weren't necessarily there. It required a little bit too much, but I digress. Like, there's still plenty of playable decks. It's just those 5 decks are the cornerstones of the meta and what you need to be prepared against, and make sure you know those matchups in order to have a semblance of success.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of at that point now where I'm pretty happy with what is available to us at the moment.
I think this meta is fantastic, especially coming out of the crap storm of BT12. I thought that meta was terrible.
Yeah, so I'm pretty happy. I don't have much complaints because I can play just about 3 of my favorite decks are viable and very, very good. So I'm quite happy with that. Might not maybe one of your decks aren't available to you if someone's out there and your deck isn't good enough to do it. That's unfortunate. It's just maybe not the right time, but I think it's pretty good for what we have. There's a lot that you can do, a lot of very different playstyles. So there's bound to be something for someone, and that's not a lot of games can say that.
Yeah, especially, like, I peer into Magic and I peer into Yu-Gi-Oh and some other games every now and then, and they're definitely not in as good of a position meta-wise as what I think Digimon is in. I think, like, the way Magic has changed over the past couple of years really has not been very healthy towards the game at all, in terms of like looking at how each of the different formats is behaving and the style of cards that they're printing and how those are impacting the metas. I don't think that they have been very healthy for a while. I think like the big fall for Magic was more Battle for Zendikar. Starting with Eldrazi Winter, that's kind of when everything kind of goes downhill. You could kind of say maybe Siege Rhino and Tarkir is where things started to go wrong, but I think like them just finishing the fetch cycle was something inevitably going to happen, and it just unfortunately impacted Standard. But right now for Magic, Standard is dead. Standard is 100% dead into the ground. It is arena only, and as much as I'd like to say that's a shame, it's not like we didn't see that coming. Nobody's playing Standard at this point. No stores holding Standard events at this point. And that's really telling on how bad of a state Magic is in. And Yu-Gi-Oh, I honestly think that people just have Stockholm Syndrome with Yu-Gi-Oh. I don't know why people play that game.
I think Yu-Gi-Oh is a weird thing because I think there's a lot of decks that can compete. It's just you're not really competing. It's more so did my strategy go off? Cool. I won. You didn't. That's basically it. I don't think that's very fun. Some people for some reason some people like that. Um, I don't, but people like what they like. And it's also one of those the big three, you know how it is. It just has the Yu-Gi-Oh name, so more people can see it, or more people have access to it since so much of the product is out and available. um, it's weird. I don't know why. I really am not the biggest fan of Yu-Gi-Oh, but I can go back and play it. Like if somebody asks me to play Master, I'll play. I won't probably be playing any of the super meta decks or anything like that, but I'll play and it's fun. But
I mean, that's why I have salads for that same reason. Somebody asks me and really wants me to play Yu-Gi-Oh with them. It's like, okay, I at least have something, and it's not like it's going to lose 100% of the time because, like you said, it is more turn one shutdown. Like, did I combo off or set up on my turn one to basically make it so you can't play the game? Cool.
does my opponent be out? If they do, you lose. If they don't, you win. Woo! That's literally the whole game in a nutshell. Like it's just it's quite unfortunate that it's devolved into that. But some people for some reason like that, and they like that puzzle breaking style of gameplay where they go into their next turn and then it's like, okay, what do they have access to? How do I break this board with the cards I have in hand, or how do I get to the point of breaking this board and then either making my comeback or not? More often than not, you don't get to do that. At least from my experience, that could just be completely biased, which is 100% fair. And you can call me wrong. That's fine. But from my experience, it's just usually you don't get the out. You might have an interruption or two to maybe try and stop your opponent with a hand trap or something. But nowadays, decks can play out of hand traps so easily that your hand trap might have prevented like the massive ridiculous board, but they still get just enough to make it near impossible for you to play.
Yeah, and then I know One Piece has been having its own struggles with the absolute dominance of red for the past 3 sets, almost 4 sets, to the point where they had to start banning cards in red constantly. Right now we're on temporary red bans because they're not aligned with Japans, which I don't know if that's something maybe Digimon could adopt. I think that would be cool, having temporary bans where, okay, this card is unhealthy for this format, but it could come back later. I don't know if they'll implement that. I love that idea. I know the game that I worked on, Argent Saga, we did that also, where it's just like, okay, we know this is unhealthy now, but there's going to be an answer later to be able to combat it and take care of the problem. But One Piece has had a absolute dumpster fire with the absolute dominance of red. I've been looking at their top results, and it's all been red, or red in some way, shape, or form, between Redbeard, Zoro, and Luffy and Law. Like, they're all red decks.
See, I don't know. I've been playing One Piece a lot recently. and I've been enjoying it mainly because, like for example, I've been I have yet to lose to a red green Zoro or a red green Zoro, red green Law, or Whitebeard, and I'm playing Doflamingo and Yamato, so blue and yellow deck, and I notice that yes, they are definitely harder to play into because they just have more access to just outright removal. Is what it is. Like a lot of the decks in the game don't have access to just board wipe removal that red does have currently, which is changing coming in the next set or two. Back to back, they're adding more things to deal with that, so that more decks have prominence. But I think you can tell, like, at least if we're looking like at results and things like that, the better players with other colors can still squeeze through. Like, you'll see there'll be, like, for example, Gen Con was a Doflamingo player, won a blue Doflamingo, and didn't drop a set, didn't drop a game. It was, but it's a very good deck, but you need to pilot it very good. I think better players will play other colors and then destroy those people that are playing just Unga Bunga aggro
I mean,
more often than not.
that's where purple is right now for Digimon. So like that's just a common trait in a lot of card games. Like the better pilot usually will end up doing well as long as like their deck is also pretty good. And then there's obviously like various other factors like matchup data and all that stuff. But I think where Digimon currently is for BT13, it's in a good spot. We're going to be getting the reprint set soon. That's going to open up things more by adding the Ghost Games characters and the start of a Monzimon deck. So that's going to be cool. And then to wrap things up for BT13, we have the starter decks at the very tail end of it. So I think like between all of the different changes, there's going to be enough like diversity in BT13 being a longer extended format. So I'm happy that we're in this format for months rather than something like BT12 for months.
Yeah, I have no complaints here. I'm enjoying my time playing the decks I want to play.
But
I'm playing a lot of Gallant Mon and Balthamon. Loving my time right now.
going into one of the other major topics, which is something that I've been kind of seeing a little bit in the community and wanted to start experimenting with myself. It's not alternate formats. I'm not going to say we're playing alternate formats. I think that the game is still too early for alternate formats to actually, be a viable thing. It's more just changing up what we're playing with. So I ran a Jank Night event where the idea was just to not play top tier competitive decks. And I thought the event was pretty well. Like we did see a lot of different decks, and we noticed something more towards the middle end of it where it's just like, oh, what actually constitutes as Jank? Because in my little event, there was like around 12 people that played in it, and Imperial ended up winning. And it's not like it was the jankiest Imperial. It was a pretty fairly standard Imperial list, more focused on the BT12 cards rather than some of the other stuff. So it was just more DNA focused, and it ended up kind of steamrolling just because compared to like true Jank, it was still just better than a lot of other decks. So I think like the thing that we were kind of settling on is like, okay, what constitutes as Jank is number one, and then what kind of power level are we actually looking at? Because we're trying to like not necessarily dumb the game down, but just play something slightly different, slightly lower power to have a different experience than just hardcore, true competitive all the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many cards in this game that you'll probably never see the light of day anymore because they just fall out to the wayside. Like for example, I played a Bond of Courage, purple it was a ridiculous deck. It was something absolutely stupid, like a Jawgrass. I had Chimera Mons. I had a it was a whole thing. Um, it was hilariously fun, but it was really bad. But I stole a few wins. I mean, I got third place in the thing. Um, it's like things like that. Like you will never see. You will never ever see them. Because you can't really, in at least when we go into the actual events and things like that, you can't. There's way less creativity. Like they're predominantly solved. All these bigger decks are solved. You might see the occasional random card here or there, but like for the most part, if I build a Greymon deck, Greymon dot deck, you'll probably see all the same cards that you will see in just about like 30 other lists, and it's just that way because they're better. Why would I? Why would you play anything worse than the cards that are going to get you more wins? So I like the idea of the Jank tournament, just to show off some cards that maybe you would never see normally, um, and allow people to make creative decks, things
And
like that.
I think that's kind of where, like, I want to try to define what jank is. So anyone in the chat or comment section, wherever, however you're listening to this, like, if you have an idea on what you define as jank, feel free to type it out, shoot the message. I'm always curious to see what people think. But as far as like what I actually think jank is, I'm going to start off by saying I don't think decks that predominantly build themselves, I would not constitute that as jank, because Digimon is a fairly archetypical heavy game. So there's just a lot of like auto builds and auto includes just because, oh, I'm playing Imperial. I'm going to use Dino Beamon and Stingmon. Okay? Uh, what Dino Beamon and what Stingmon? Oh, the one that allows me to DNA the most efficient. And I'm just like, well,
So then, is that really
yeah,
jank?
it's like it's not really jank. I think like I would say more jank would be something like what we saw with your build, where you have your little core strategy, which is to get up into your bond. And then you
Nope.
have so much flexibility and freedom on all of the other cards around it to try to formulate how your deck is going to be winning. And depending on what you use, you could kind of change your win con a little bit. So, like, most of the time when I think of a Bond of Courage deck, I know I'm only using Bond of Courage to win the game. I'm basically using it as I'm going to swing, delete the opponent's Digimon, delete their security, my swing is for game. So I would lean more towards early game aggression and pressure, and then try to have a couple of cards here and there to set up my tamers, just to do that for free because now we have the ability and access to. So like you could build like a shine variant of that where you're using most of the shine cards, or you would have a tie variant where you're using cards that interact and synergize with tie more specifically. So like there's different levels to how you could approach the deck, and one's not necessarily that much better than the other because they're trying to accomplish the same thing but slightly differently, and they give you different tools to be able to work with. And I think that's where the true jank starts to form, is in these incomplete packages.
I'm telling you, no one even got to see the full thing of my deck. That deck was ridiculous, dude. Like, I had the Metal Guru Ace in the deck. I had I had some crazy cards in that deck. Like, I think only one person saw the Ace, and they were like, "What the heck?" Because I swung with a Chimera, past the turn. He swung something into security. I aced, stole the turn back, and then I killed him with the bond the next turn. It's like things like that where you see some funny interactions, or it's cool. Like there's so many cool cards and so many cool ways to interact with those cards that we don't get to see because of the meta and how we it's just how the player bases are when it comes to these games.
I'm,
focus solely on the meta and what's actually going to get them the most wins possible, which isn't necessarily a wrong thing to do.
But I also think people also want to sometimes dial it back and have a slightly different experience, which is why I even wanted to attempt a Jank Knight to begin with. But going into further defining what Jank is, that's just my definition on Jank, something that doesn't 110% build itself, something that is a little bit more incomplete, that leaves room for customization and not just like, oh, I get a option between one of two cards. I'm talking about like, no, like more customization depending on how you're trying to lean or swing the deck. So I think like Angoramon at right now is a pretty good example. Right now, the deck for the most part you could build it off of itself because it has a lot of, we already have like enough Angoramon synergy cards to have something. It's just
Just no
missing a top
boss.
end. Yes, it's just missing a top end. So like I would even say like maybe if you're just missing that core key little piece and that little piece just lets you do a lot of different things with, maybe that's where kind of I would start drawing the line at Jank, because you have to change how you're approaching the deck based on what level 6 you're going to be using. So you could use Leopardmon, you could use Grandis, you could use like anything you want as long as it's trying to fit inside of the theme on how Angoramon is trying to play, and it has that freedom to have those options. And that's where the true jank starts to come out. Because we've seen this time and time again with blue hybrids, where it's just like blue hybrids wasn't necessarily this hardcore solved thing. It was mostly solved, but it wasn't 110% there, and we kept changing out the top end, and yellow hybrids did the same thing. But I think those are leaning more towards into the competitive aspect because there's less room for flexibility because you're only changing one small aspect of the deck.
Yeah, those are a little bit different because they were already good even without the top end. The top end, them solving what the top end was, like for example, blue hybrid, getting into a Zulongmon and things like that.
Yeah, and then they
That's
just
what they
changed it out
usually
from
settled on.
yeah, and then they changed it out for Mirage when they realized Mirage was really good. So like they just, and yellow hybrids did that too much in Japan to basically warrant a nerf, was
Yeah,
because like it borderline cannibalized yellow as an entire color.
there was just no way to really play another yellow deck. Why would you play any other yellow deck when yellow hybrid did it essentially 100 times better?
The
Always.
the sad thing is if you are a yellow player, yellow hybrid still is actually the best deck.
It
That's
really just
that's
is. That's the worst part about it. If you're going by like pure yellow, it really just is the best yellow deck.
uh
Still.
yeah, and that deck came out in BT7 and hasn't really changed a whole lot. Like I've seen a lot of people work in some shine stuff to be able to play their tamers a little bit more efficiently, but like you're just adding in
Unnecessary
like
stuff.
you had enough space to just add in whatever the next best yellow thing was, and that was the problem with yellow hybrids. But that's why I wouldn't constitute something like that as jank, where like you have probably about 70% of the core already done. We could even maybe bump that up to 80. Like the deck mostly just kind of uses it and builds itself. And then you just run like whatever tech 1 or 2 of extra cards in whatever playset amount you're able to run. And then the deck is kind of done. So I think like decks that are really truly jank aren't necessarily just bad decks. I think bad decks are just more in the meme category, and that's its own separate thing. So like
Yeah.
a lot of people will say, "Oh, is Poopmon a bad deck or a jank deck?" And I would be like, "Yes and no. You could have some jankiness to it, but I think for the most part, because of how Poop is and the amount of support Poop has, it's not necessarily a jank deck. It's just a bad deck." Which that's something different. Like jank could go toe to toe with bad, and I think those are two categories I would probably be okay with combining, or just letting exist in the same environment in terms of play. But in terms of like, is that actual jank? No, it's not.
I agree there. I don't think like the core strategy is there, and the strategy itself isn't awful. It's just not good. Um, which is two dramatically different things. Like, when I think of like Jank, I think of like going back to like BT8 and playing Metal Guru Jawgrass. I don't know if you ever played that deck or heard of that deck, but that deck, that was like to me what Jank is. A amalgamation of archetypes that should not go together, but they did, and they functioned really well.
People are doing that right now with Anubismon and Gizumon, just because the Gizumon stuff has some stickiness to it. It dies, replaces itself, and then with Anubismon on the field, you just swing again. I don't know how effective or efficient that deck is, but I would label that more on the jank category. And not all jank decks can be bad or are going to be bad. Most of the time, they kind of are leaning more towards that bad side than good side. But the fun part is you're experimenting, and that's like the heart of what I wanted to try to set out and achieve is this experimentation on we're going to be using cards we might not normally have otherwise to try to find a unique or interesting interaction to do something completely spicy or different with. And Japan has seen some pretty success in their jank. Like, I would probably say the Black War Greymon OTK deck, that would lean more into jank that ended up turning into something more competitive. I think Millith is also in that type of a category where it was kind of more this jank thing that people wouldn't realistically think about doing until they actually found some success in it because of the not only just unfamiliarity, but just how spicy you can be with the different types of tools you're mixing and matching.
Yeah, like you could optimize these jank decks. Like for example, Millith is kind of that story, like the underdog story, where it really wasn't that great, but then the right people got their hands on it, really grinded it, and made it efficient so that their game plan got to the point where it just there's no way to stop the game plan. You're just doing and doing and doing, and that's jank. That just and it just happens to be very good at doing what it does. But even then, like you still don't see it very often. You see it every now and then, but it also requires a good pilot to make that happen. So
to be fair, I think purple is kind of like in terms of jank, like raw jank. I think purple is the easiest color to come up with just virtually anything with because from a mechanical aspect, it just has a lot going on with it where it's just like, oh, I want stuff in my graveyard. There's three different ways to put stuff into my graveyard, and I get to use basically all of them. And it's really just up to you to figure out what is the most optimal way for how the deck is wanting to play. Like we've seen Beelstarmon as another example. People would probably define that as kind of a jank deck because you could run so many different things inside of that deck and it all just works because it doesn't care about anything specific other than I'm going to slam my Beelstar for 0, use an option, and that's it. The rest of that game plan, you could do whatever you want. So purple is kind of the cheat color when it comes to building jank.
Yeah, I guess so. I never really thought about it like that, but yeah, a lot of purple decks can fall into that spectrum of jank. But I guess it's also one of those things that it's kind of hard to define because everybody's gonna have a different view of that. At least when you get into a wider group of people. With us, we could probably consolidate it and be like, okay, this is what we think. Is this the consensus for everybody? Yes, no. Get feedback, see if it works that way. But like, some people will look at. I think people just have the misconception that jank just means bad. So then they'll look at, for example, like we in that tournament, we used Imperial Dramon, Dark Knightmon. Those are not jank decks, in all honesty. They're just not great decks.
Yeah, they're just the meta just shunned them out because they're not effective enough at doing what they need to do, or like whatever their goal or game plan isn't conducive for where the meta needs it to be. But like that's where the power discrepancy starts to come in, and there could be power discrepancy between Jank, but at least like with Jank, at least like the way I've kind of been defining it, like it is kind of unexpected, and that's the fun, is the surprise. It's not necessarily this Jank is just that overpowered. It is this Jank was just that surprising.
Oh yeah, they were super surprised when my Skull Greymon swung 4 security checks. that was a pretty ridiculous game. Oh man. I love those decks. I love decks where you can do things like that, and they're super fun, or the interactions are fun. Like, who did I play against? It was oh my god, what was he playing? I won't even lie to you, I have no clue what he was playing. It was a green deck, but I don't know what it was. He really didn't get to play. I won't lie, I kind of just killed him too quickly.
I mean, but that's what the deck is trying to do. It's using your various different low-end pieces to be able to try to support how you want to use Bond. And like
jamming level 4. Jamming red level 4.
Oh, yeah.
I had that in the deck because I was using options like what is it called? Like lightning joust and things like that. Just so I can hit big numbers really quickly, and that's how I essentially OTK'd that person turn 2. Because I played a tie turn 1, promoted. He gave me like 3 memory. I played 2 of the option, which gave my security attack +3, so he swung 4 checks, swung 4, double hybrid with 2 tamers. It was pretty sad.
I mean, that's just how you built your deck and what it was trying to do. Obviously, if you had any kind of defense or ways to play around that or security options, then things would probably be a different story. But that's like the jank that you were trying to come up with, is how can I turn something that's not highly used into something that's slightly better? And again, the idea is that surprise of the combination of cards that you're working with, rather than a pre-canned thing that just so happened to not be very good for where the meta currently is. And sometimes, like bad decks, in terms of how we define bad decks, they have their own little subcategory on how bad are actual bad decks. So something like Imperial, I wouldn't say is really that bad. It wasn't like that great, but compared to a lot of other like lesser tiered decks, it still can compete fairly well, because a lot of like what makes competitive decks, well, competitive, is their speed, consistency, how easy it is to set up, and bad decks don't necessarily care or have any of those different factors. Imperial at least is trying to be competitive, it's just not good at being competitive. But something compared to like if I were to run just straight up purple hybrids, I think like Imperial would kick the butt out of purple hybrids. But purple hybrids, I can shift into something more jank worthy, because, I mean, yes, it's purple, but because it doesn't necessarily have a completed package, and I could play a whole bunch of different cards around what purple hybrids is trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's well put, well said.
So, I don't know. I know a lot of other people are thinking about just alternative ways of playing the game, and I'm going to be experimenting it with my events that I usually run on Saturdays. I also do stream them if everyone's listening to this, so tune in on Saturdays, and usually that's when I'm running events if I'm not competing in any.
Join the fun.
Yeah.
It's a good time.
And that's the type of environment that I want. I want the people to have their competitive outlet, but I also know people don't always want their competitive fix. Sometimes they just want like a fix on just having a different way to approach the game. And I'm not necessarily meaning it needs to be an alternate format using a completely different rule set to be able to make cards usable or inversely unusable. I'm talking more, I still want to keep the core game intact, just approach it at a different angle. And one of the angles that I thought of to coincide with like Jank Night was the idea of like, hey, what if we just have basically this self-imposed limitation on we're just not going to play archetype decks. And that's kind of like where my idea of Jank kind of came from, is the fact that like there's still lots of cards in the game that are just generically good. So what if we strip the archetype cards away from the game and figure out how to play the game without archetypes? I think that would be a really different and fresh way. I'm not changing any of the core rules other than the fact that if a card is referencing another card or archetype, you just won't be able to use that. So yes, it turns basically consistency into a crapshoot because you have to rely purely on pure draw power rather than search power. So like it's just taking the game and putting a new fresh spin on it. You could kind of label that as an alternate format. I really wouldn't, because that's just a self-imposed gentleman's agreement that, okay, my Agumon is not going to search out my Greymon that's going to then play my Tai Kamiya. It's like, no, I'm going to have to find alternative means to be able to set up and get to whatever my win con is that's not archetype based. And we do have plenty of cards to make that happen, and I think that's going to be like a really fun thing to experiment with.
Oh, I mean, that sounds hilariously fun. And I already have some stupid ideas already in my head.
I mean, like, granted, certain cards are very hardcore archetypical, and then there are certain things like security control that are very not archetypical, but I would also have a gentleman's agreement that nobody plays security control because that would probably end up winning just because it is one of the few decks that's not archetypical that fits within side of the alternative rule set, you could say. So, but you could build something, yeah, you could build something kind of close to it. Like, it is, the idea was just to rely more on the mechanics of the game rather than the archetypes of the game.
Yeah, I'm 100% down. That sounds like fun. See what we could, see what people come up with. That's always the best part. See what the, who makes the most creative looking decks and things like that.
And I think that would be really fun to do. If anyone's curious, I don't have any prizing for any of my events. I axed that a while ago just because entry fees and prizing, I learned really quickly if I'm just trying to build something for fun, people generally don't join because then they feel obligated to want to be competitive. And that's not exactly where I wanted to be with that. I don't want to force people to try to be competitive. I want to make sure people can have fun. And that's all we're trying to do at the end of the day. And why this was even a thought discussion was because we're just trying to have fun. And I'm not trying to impose like an alternate format down people's throats like Chosen One. I don't like those types of things where I'm trying to basically force the game to be something it's not. No, I'm taking the game, leaving it mostly intact, and then adding a small little twist, kind of like what Bandai has done with Ultimate Cups. You're still playing Digimon. It's just they have a slight tweak to the rule set to try to freshen it up a little bit. And I think that's where a lot of like fun could be had, because there's just a lot of different things that we could do with the base and core of the game and what cards we have, what they could or inversely could not allow.
Interesting. Okay.
But I know that's my definition on Jank. What's your definition on Jank, Teddy?
I mean, a big thing for me is not necessarily having pure archetype. Like, if I can, as you said earlier, I kind of agree very much. So, like, I grab a Vmon. Okay, well, I can either lean towards, Armor Rush, or I can lean towards Imperial Dramon. Like, it's, that to me does not mean jank because that means there's a predetermined plan and you have cards that function directly towards that plan. Whereas, like, I made the example earlier, Metal Gurumon Jogress. There is literally that whole deck is a mosh posh of cards that do not share any synergy whatsoever. Aside from the fact that Metal Gurumon slams down level 4s, and then they can Jogress and go continue back up the chain, and then keep attacking. Like, um, so it's not necessarily a good deck, but it doesn't necessarily have to be bad. Like, for example, you were saying, like, there's a way you can build, like, security-based decks with Jank. Not security control itself, but security-based Jank deck. And I think I have something, honestly, right here that's fits that bill. Where it's just a bunch of blue and yellow draw cards and Jogress, and there's really you're not really playing. You're playing security control, but you're not really because you're still attacking. You're still wanting to build a body on the board, and it's not very good, but it's funny, and when it works, it's pretty cool. But it's not great, and you can lose very easily just from bricking. But that's stuff like that. Like, your power level necessarily doesn't need to be amazing. It doesn't need to be bad either. Like, that Bond of Friendship or Bond of Courage deck I made isn't. I honestly don't think it's bad at all. I think it's just it. I was able to kill somebody turn 2, literally turn 2. I killed it. Like, that. Most people would be like, "Wow, that's pretty solid." I'm like, "Yeah, it's okay," but the circumstances aligned so that I could do that. But that's not something that happens very often, and things like that don't happen frequently. So more often than not, I'm playing with that deck as a control. Like, I have my aggro with my level 4s and my level 3s, and then I have ways to do stupid stuff like spawn bodies, Jogress, the Chimera, keep a body out, and then do stupid things like with the Metal Guru Ace, steal their turn, all that other stuff. Like, the deck was really bad. It was really bad, but it was funny. And that's kind of where I am with, like, Jank in general. Like, you realistically need to be, like, creative with a deck. Like, for example, Mark Die. If you remember, Mark's decks are always ridiculous, dude. Always, his decks are ridiculous. But I like that he makes them because he goes out of his way to look through all of the cards. Like, okay, I'm making, like, for example, he played Mamemon, which is an archetypal deck, but there's not enough to form a singular archetype. Like, it's not, you still need to put a lot of things and jam in a lot of stuff from outside of archetype to make the deck function, which is what he did. And it was hilarious. It's funny. It's really really funny.
Because
To
if
watch
anyone,
it,
if anyone's unfamiliar with Mamemon, basically they have a top end, they don't have a low end. So you have to really customize what your low end and what your option package is to try to best support the inline top end that you're playing with. And then because the Mamemons all were printed at different times, they're all doing different things that have basically nothing to do with what the deck is actually trying to do. It's like, it is kind of a hodgepodge, but there's at least a couple of cards to try to tie it in together. Most of it is on the level 6s. But and then
hilarious.
Catch Mamemon is also the level 5 that ties it together.
Yeah, and it's actually not that bad. Honestly, that card is not really bad at all. But, like, that to me, yes, it is technically, if we were to go by my own words, it is an archetype deck because they all function with the keyword Mamemon and all that other stuff. That's literally how the deck functions. But there isn't enough of that to make a full deck, so he has to go out of his way and really look at cards and be like, okay, how does this work? okay, this gives me jamming, or this gives me reboot. Okay, cool. Um, does that work with this? No, it doesn't. Okay, and then he had to really go through, and I'm telling you, like for some unknown reason, he really played the heck out of that deck.
That's kind of how it was for me in Leomon, because right now blue/green Leomon really doesn't have anything super cohesive. We have a couple of cards to tie the deck together, like the Leomon X and Pangeamon X, and then we did get the new Pangeamon that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
that could set up the Jerry that could play. Like we have cards to like and
You
plays.
have an archetype, but it's not a fully functioning archetype,
No,
and they
because
don't
we don't
do
have a
anything.
level 6, and we don't have like an actual good
You have
dedicated
a level
level
six,
6.
but it's bad.
No, like I forget that card even exists. We don't have a level
Exactly.
6.
Yeah, if
Um
you have one, this is really bad.
no,
This is
we
really really bad.
don't. So, we don't have a true dedicated level 6, and we don't
Correct.
have a Dino Rexmon or Dino Tigermon. He does not count. He's so bad I don't even know his name.
Yeah, he's pretty bad. He's a pretty bad card.
So
I've tried.
he does not count in my books. Like objectively like awful cards just do not count in my books.
See, so like things like
But
that
it
to me
doesn't but the
are
fact
not.
that it doesn't have a low end also is concerning because I have no way to search them out. I have no way to be able to like efficiently digivolve and be able to do more inline and in archetype things, and I have to rely on the mechanics to be able to try to circumvent and make up some of that. So it's just like
Let's see.
instead of a searcher I might use BT1 draw Agumon, and or not Agumon, draw Gabumon. And
Gabumon,
because I'm playing a Gabumon, maybe now I want to shift the deck to be part Leomon, part Gabubond. Like that's
see,
that's
that's where it's
where
like you could do things like that, and it's
yeah,
I
and I would say
understand.
that's more janky because it's just playing around with the mechanics that you're working with to fill out the spots that you don't normally have.
And then, like, what I don't think is like jank is like, let's say for example, I'm playing Shine Greymon, and then I'm like, okay, well, what if I mix something else with Shine Greymon? I don't think that's jank because you can just fall back on the Shine Greymon, and the Shine Greymon's so good on its own
I mean,
that
that's what War Greymon does. They change out their top end all the time. It's just like, okay, now I'm playing Ancient Greymon instead of War Greymon. You're still playing 90% the same cards,
I
and
was like,
you
it's
just have to change a couple of cards around to make the fact that you're paying 5 to Evo work.
and it's really not that hard. Like, it's not like those don't fall under jank for me.
I mean, you're making
Um,
the deck worse, but I wouldn't label that as like actual jank because the 90% of the competitive core is there. You're just choosing to objectively play the wrong cards just to try to label it as jank.
yeah, exactly. That's not jank to me. Um, so it's hard. It's one of those things that you can't. There's no real one. There's no real one way to define it. But that's kind of where I am with it. Where you, it you need to look back, and when I make a deck, if it's a jank deck, I'm looking at it. Okay, what do I want my card that, for example, no one uses? And I've been using. Funnily enough, I did make an Anubismon deck, um, and that was going to be like my thing. Okay, Anubismon mill turbo with the Guilmons that you slam and then swing, Guil, slam, swing, slam, swing, and then do stupid things like that. Like that that is jank because there's no archetype at all for Anubismon at all. Like there's no like actual Anubismon deck yet. Um, and two, they the archetype or that the deck itself doesn't necessarily function well together, but you can make them work together. But it requires a little bit of effort and a little bit of creativity with the cards that you use and things like that. Like that stuff to me is like what I would think is like the epitome of like jank. Um, It's kind of hard. It's very hard to describe, but
Yeah, because I'm sure everyone has their own definition of jank, and for some, their definition of jank just might be bad. And that's clearly what I kind of saw in my Jank Night event, which is something I'm kind of going to try to work on, is locking down, like, what a more concrete, what we kind of agree on is jank. It's going to take a couple of events. I am very
yeah,
well aware of that, just to figure out kind of where the power level should be. Because at the end of the day, Digimon is getting to the point where it's not like absurdly high power. It's nowhere near Yu-Gi-Oh! But it's getting to the point where it's high power. It's high power enough to where Bandai understands the direction of the game, and they understand more on some of the limits that they're allowed to do in terms of how they're making cards. Like, that's why we've seen green be in such a bad state. That's why we've seen yellow be in such a bad state. Like, it's because they learned from their mistakes and are trying their hardest not to repeat them.
yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. The game is it's honestly kind
But
of crazy how fast it is.
But
You
at
know?
the same time, people want sometimes that lower level of experience, which is why a lot of the people really like Ultimate Cup, is because that it is that attempt from Bandai to have a style of play that you could play to try to lower the overall power level, and then they've been actively limiting cards to try to make Ultimate Cup better as a competitive event, because based on just that simple rule change, there was still a lot of work that needed to be done, and they acknowledged that, because it was probably just a afterthought in terms of like what they wanted to do. And then they were like, oh shoot, now we actually kind of have to try to micromanage this a little bit harder, which is what we're seeing, and it's kind of what I like. I wish that they would pay a little bit more attention to Digimon as a whole, in terms of like making sure that the game is going to be in the best state that it possibly can be. Because I know other people had their own like custom ban lists, and I know some people are experimenting with other different rule sets, and there's a lot of stuff that the community is trying to do. But I also think they're also trying to make that as competitive as viable instead of as fun as they possibly can. And that's the type of mentality that I'm trying to do, is I'm looking at it more for the fun aspect rather than the competitive aspect, which is why my events are free.
That makes 100% sense to me. I mean, uh, it's fine to have those things. Like we'll have. It's not like we're just getting rid of the normal standard format as it is. It's just every now and then I understand to just take a step back. Let's make a let's do a night where days are just stupid decks, things that are hilarious, make people laugh, and see cards that you'll usually never see. And I think that's not a bad thing to want to do.
Or combos you might not even have thought about, because there is a lot. Like, the card pool isn't insane, but there's still
There's
just
a lot of cards.
there's a good amount of cards and unique interactions that we could think up and try to make it into a reality, in terms of like, hey, I played it this way and it actually worked and it was really fun. And that's the big takeaway on what I was attempting to do, and why I wanted to even bring up the definition of jank and how we could approach a lower power experience that's more fun, welcoming, and creative.
Yeah, and I think another thing that's also there is kind of like a smaller thing is usually this is usually with Jank, and these decks tend to be more budget friendly.
I mean, the whole
So
game is budget friendly. Like, actually, the fun thing is sometimes bad decks are actually more expensive than good
yeah,
decks. And
yeah,
that's the crazy part, is when is a bad deck actually more expensive than a good deck half the time? And sometimes it is because of the parts and pieces that people are working with for those bad decks. Like, they might need the niche secret rare that is secret rare, in order to make their deck functional, which unfortunately that is a thing, but
It is.
and sometimes the SRs are even more expensive just because nobody's really paying attention to them. So there's not a whole lot of market movement on it. But that's a completely different story.
Yeah.
But like the whole game is budget friendly, so that's not necessarily like the reason why I'm doing this. But like budget does help, and usually the lesser used or lesser known stuff is going to be a little bit cheaper than your average stuff.
Most of the time.
But
There
I
are a
mean,
few
like, if I
outliers.
could build a competitive deck for $30, like, I can't really complain that much about the game not being hard to get into. It's just more of, like, we just need that competitive refresh, where it's just like, let's slow things down, play something slightly different than what we normally did, let's try to be creative, and that increases the amount of fun somebody could have, and having that break is nice, which is why Bandai has it for Ultimate Cups, even though I don't like that.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I mean, I think Ultimate Cup is just the lazier way to do it.
Oh, it was extremely
But
lazy. Like, this year, competitively for Digimon, I'm not gonna lie, it just kind of feels like it sucks. Something just feels slightly off, and I can't exactly put my finger on it. We've talked about this before in the past in a different episode on the competitive environment, but I'm like, it does feel slightly off. And that's kind of why having something like this, to me, is kind of important, not only just to help bolster people, but to help bring some creativity and fun into the game people are kind of all droned out on.
yeah, exactly.
So that's all of the time that we are going to have for this episode. Make sure, like I said before, if you have the definition on what you think is jank, feel free to type it in the comments and feel free to shoot me a message. However you want to get that message out on your thoughts. I'm always reading, I'm always looking and listening, taking in feedback. So that means a lot to me. And then as far as other things that mean a lot to me, I do think, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did end up wanting to support the podcast, make sure to share it on social media, and make sure to leave a follow, a subscribe, a rating, a review, however you feel like you want to best support the channel. That does also mean a lot to me, because I do this mostly for you guys. And with that, I want to thank you all again for listening, and I will see you, or we will see you, in the next episode.